In any case, with this presentation, Francesco has guided us through a very interesting thought experiment that can help us understand what or how and why the Paris outcome actually matters, why it can be considered a success. And by basically running us through the counterfactual, it is really better possible to appreciate what has been achieved in Paris given the existing political constraints at the time. But it also raises a very difficult question, and it's a question that David also touched upon in the introduction. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? So basically, how do we even measure success? So what I want to do in this comment on the presentation is discuss three possible measures of success. So let me start with the first benchmark. The first benchmark, I think, is going to be participation. And I think most of us can, or definitely those who've been involved in the process in Paris, can probably agree that the agreement as such is quite shallow. We might have our disagreements about how shallow, but generally we might have some issues with it. But at the same time, when you look at the ratification, or the prospects for ratification and entry into force, I think it is actually looking quite good. And I think the first indicator for that was simply the enthusiasm with which the agreement was accepted and welcomed in Paris. So everyone cheering, everyone saying good things about it after the agreement was adopted. But also the entry into force requirements are actually, in my view, surprisingly lenient. So what the entry into force requirements are at this stage is that 55 countries, or 55 parties, representing 55% of global emissions, need to ratify the agreement for it to enter into force. It's a similar agreement or a similar provision as in the Kyoto Protocol, but with the Kyoto Protocol it only applied to developed countries, and now it applies to all countries. So that means that if the high ambition coalition which emerged in Paris would also then turn into a fast ratifying coalition, I think entry into force can be happening quite soon. Maybe even this year. However, it might not apply to all countries. So I think for one country, the United States is probably the clearest. So the United States, we have a president who has a very clear ambition to leave a legacy when it comes to climate change. So my prediction would be that the United States will probably be one of the first countries to actually try and ratify this. For the EU, it's already going to be a little bit more difficult because there's at least one member state, Poland, who has been more clearly opposed to the agreement or parts of the agreement. So I think there's going to be a very interesting political discussion happening in the European Union this year. For other countries such as China, the question is maybe not necessarily if they're going to ratify, but rather when. So, but participation of governments is not the only thing that matters. I think it's also important to look at what non-state actors have been doing. And I think it's really one of the most amazing things that we have witnessed in the last couple of years. We see a whole wide range of initiatives of non-state actors, of civil society, of businesses, of subnational authorities, including cities and regional governments, really having taken a lot of actions, coming up with the unilateral commitments to address climate change, either mitigation or adaptation. And there's a platform these days under the UNFCCC, it's called the Nonstate Actor Zone for Climate Action, or NASCA, which was established in Peru, and it now lists over 10,000 actions by these actors. And I think that's impressive. Of course, that these commitments are there doesn't mean that the action is actually taking place, but at least the good intentions are certainly there. So I think that it shows that there's an increasing awareness that climate action is not necessarily confined just to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or just to national governments, but that a wide coalition of actors is necessary to take action. So also this groundswell is increasingly recognized in the intergovernmental process, which I find also quite an interesting development. And the decision that Francesco already highlighted, so the COP decision complementing the agreement, they specify not only that ongoing processes called the Lima Paris Action Agenda will continue in the next few years, but they also suggest that every year there will be a high-level event and that there also will be 2 high-level champions to basically encourage and promote non-state action. So I think this is generally a positive thing. So what we're seeing is wide participation. So by that benchmark, probably we can consider the Paris Agreement a success. Then a second measure would be the notion of ratcheting up, basically saying, will the Paris Agreement actually lead to more ambition over time? To be clear, my view of the ratcheting mechanism of the Paris Agreement is that it's far from perfect. I think one of the best things about it is the long-term goals that Francesco has already highlighted. But what's also useful, what we can say, is that there's a facilitative dialogue in 2018, followed by the stock takes that Francesco was already referring to, which will happen from every 5 years from 2023 onwards. And I think that will be good to have a regular discussion. But there's no strong connection between these events, between these stock takes, and the nationally determined contribution. So how will they actually feed into the ambition of the nationally determined contributions in the future? There are some links, but I think the links are not very strong. And also the other challenge, I think, is that the stock take is a discussion in aggregate. So how our parties are doing all together, rather than how are individual parties doing. Is what China or the United States is proposing, is that ambitious or is that fair? No such discussions will necessarily take place. It will take place at an aggregate level. But one of the achievements in these discussions, and I really applaud the negotiators for achieving this, is that they've at least made sure that there are some principles that really show that that ambition will increase over time. So there's a notion or a principle of regression that has been enshrined in the agreement. But more importantly, there's no limitation for this principle. So some countries have proposed ideas such as force majeure, or basically saying, well, if there are economic shocks, then this principle does not apply. And the agreement does not mention this at all, and I think that has been very much welcome. But then also, because I think in the end that would have basically led to Pandora's box, because of course, what are economic shocks? Every country can define it for him or herself. So, but what we're seeing after Paris is that immediately some countries like Canada and Argentina were saying, okay, we'll actually start thinking about revising our contribution upwards. And also France, so President Hollande was immediately saying, before 2020, we'll come up with something more ambitious. But then for the EU, it's already less clear. Like the EU Commissioner, the Climate Commissioner, Cañete, immediately said, well, no, we're not going to up our ambition. But in the end, that will be up to the European Union's Environment Council in a few months' time. But in the end, I think it's unclear whether, let's say, this benchmark, against this benchmark, we can consider Paris a success, because I think at this stage, it's still unclear whether we're going to see a race to the bottom or a race to the top. And then finally, a benchmark which I find personally very interesting, given my own research interest, is that right after Paris, an academic, Arun Agrawal, suggested that the best way to judge whether Paris is a success is to look at the stock prices for fossil fuels on Monday morning right after Paris. I did so, and of course they were fluctuating a little bit, they were going down a little bit, but I think the measure as such is maybe a little bit too simplistic, because of course the Paris Agreement is just one factor among many that determine the fossil fuel prices. But at the same time, and this is why I think he does raise an important point, because I think we need to more carefully think about the link between climate change policy, both at the international level and at the national level, and fossil fuel development. So if we take the findings from scientific research seriously, so last year there was a paper by Paul Eakins and Kristen McGlade, who basically suggested that if we really want to keep below 2 degrees, we might have to leave more than 2/3 of our fossil fuels underground. So if we really want to take that seriously, we need to think about the link between climate policy and fossil fuel development. And only then can we really suggest whether the Guardian headline at the time, I think it was on Sunday or Monday, is that the Paris Agreement is hailing the end of a fossil fuel era. Only then can we judge whether that headline was actually true. So just a few facts that happened last month, and I personally find this tremendously interesting. First, the shares of the leading US coal producers, Peabody, have plummeted in the last month. And also the second largest producer in the United States, Arch, filed for bankruptcy this week. Second, crude oil prices have dropped below $30 for the first time in 12 years. Also just last week. Coal imports in both China and India have gone down significantly in the last few months. Also coal production, and this is of course related, coal production in Indonesia has also gone down. Saudi Arabia, one of the major fossil oil producers in the world, is talking about ending fossil fuel subsidies. The Chinese government, again just a few weeks ago, has put in place a 3-year moratorium on new coal mines. And only yesterday, in the end, I don't know if you've seen it in the news, Obama in the State of the Union address mentioned that he wants to limit or revise the lax rules for leasing land for oil and gas exploration. So these, in a way, are interesting developments. We cannot necessarily link them to the Paris Agreement, but there might be a link between climate policy and these developments in general. But then again, not all the news is positive, let's say, from the perspective of reducing emissions. So for example, Australia approved a major coal port last month, which really should make it easier for Australia to export coal to countries like India. And also coal demand in India, speaking of which, is continuously rising, and also oil imports in China are still rising. So I would say again on this benchmark, I think the jury is still out to which extent climate policy, including the Paris Agreement, influences fossil fuel development. But I think it's definitely time for researchers to think about these links more carefully. So in closing, and I have no idea how I'm doing on time, but I should be 1 minute now. I think that one thing that Paris allows us is that we can finally shift our attention to the areas where the real action needs to take place. And the real action in the end is not going to happen. I'm sorry to say it to the negotiators, but they'll probably know it themselves. The real action is in the end not going to happen at the UNFCCC or in Bonn. The real action is in the end going to happen at the national level, at the subnational level, by private actors, by other non-state actors. So I think the Paris Agreement and also the development of NDCs in 5-year cycles will allow us to focus on what is happening at the national level, and will allow us to really focus on how well countries are doing. And this may be also helpful in the end, helping to hold these governments to account. So I think there's also a lot of interesting research, and again, we are here at a university, so we might also think about the research areas. There's a lot of interesting research to be done purely by collecting information of how well countries are doing. And of course, for a lot of countries, especially in the EU, this type of information is already being generated. But I think these type of exercises will need to be expanded or extended to the 190 plus countries. So in the end, I think pledges do not make action, of course, but in the end they offer a compass to relevant stakeholders to really make sure that countries are doing what they say they want. So I personally welcome this shift in attention. It doesn't mean that we should stop following the UNFCCC process or that the process doesn't matter. I know I will probably be going to Marrakesh in November myself, but at least we're clearer about what we can expect from this process. Thank you.